This is the RTX 3060 Ti and it could be the ultimate budget graphics card on the used market, but there's only one way to find out for sure, and that's to give it some benchmarks at both 1080p and 1440p. The RTX 3060 Ti was quite a solid GPU back in the day, and I mean that because it was only like 4 years ago. Anyways, from what I can remember, this GPU was launched to quite a good reception, but there is one slight problem with it in 2025, and that's its 8GB of VRAM. Now it's got a 256-bit memory bus, which gives it a bit more memory bandwidth compared to something like the 4060 or 4060 Ti, but that lack of capacity there might become troublesome, especially at high resolutions. But in 2025, is the RTX 3060 Ti worth putting in your system? In order to answer that, we had to restore this one in a previous video, which you can watch up there or there, wherever YouTube puts it. Anyways, we've done all of our testing at both 1080p and 1440p, and we've sprinkled in some ray tracing results with DLSS quality upscaling. All testing has been done in our Ryzen 9 7900X testing PC, resizable bar has been enabled, and we've used the latest game ready driver at the time of testing. With that being said, let's get into the video. Right, let's just throw the 3060 Ti in at the deep end with Stalker 2. This game is like super hard to run. Anyways, at 1080p on the medium preset with high textures, we're getting 60 FPS on average. The 1% low isn't looking too bad at 45, but it's still not the smoothest of experiences on this graphics card. But to be honest, it's probably Stalker 2. This game is notorious for how badly it's optimized. At 1440p, we see a reduction down to 44 FPS, which is not that great, and a 1% low of 35, so the 1% low isn't looking too bad here. What I'll do is enable DLSS and you'll get a very similar performance to Full HD. No such tweaks are needed in God of War on the high preset, because across both resolutions we're getting absolutely phenomenal performance. 101 FPS on average at 1080p will do very nicely, and the 1% low is also looking very smooth here, and this continues at Quad HD. 78 FPS on average on a graphics card of this caliber is absolutely, well, nothing short of brilliant, I'd like to say, and the frame time is also very smooth here at 64 frames per second. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, what can I say, this game is an absolute gem, not only with its story and gameplay, but with its optimization as well. We're getting very similar performance to God of War Ragnarok at Full HD, but we're getting a much better frame time here, so 3060 Ti is doing a very good job. And then when we go up to Quad HD, we go down to 69 FPS on average, which is very nice. But what's nicer is the frame time. It's only trailing it by like 8 FPS, which is brilliant. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is not particularly the most brilliant PC port, but the story is fantastic and I like testing this game, and yeah, at 1080p the performance is quite good. 77 FPS on average is great to see, and the frame time here is looking meh, it's okay, it's not terrible. But when we go up to 1440p, we do drop below 60 FPS on average, which is not great, but the frame time starts to clear up a bit. But what I'll do is just enable DLSS and put that into quality, and you should be a-okay at Quad HD. Cyberpunk on Ultra is not a problem for the 3060 Ti at Full HD. We're getting 88 FPS on average with a very smooth 1% low as well, so there's absolutely zero problems here. But in typical Cyberpunk fashion, it scales quite heavily with resolution, because we go down to 52 FPS, but the frame time is still looking pretty decent at 42. Like I've said like a million times in this video, just enable DLSS on quality. It works very well in Cyberpunk, and that's what I'd recommend at Quad HD. Oblivion Remastered on the medium preset with high textures is not a terrible performer, I'd like to say, because we get 60 FPS across both resolutions today for the average frame rate. But the 1% lows are rather questionable at 1080p at just 47 FPS, so that's not particularly brilliant. But at 1440p, it in fact goes up, so I'm not sure if this is just Unreal Engine jankiness or the shaders didn't compile properly or whatever. I reran the test and this is what we were getting, so yeah, it's kind of annoying, I'd like to say. So as a whole for the AAA games, 1080p performance is nothing short of brilliant on the 3060 Ti. When you pair this with the fact that this GPU costs around like £180 to £200 on the used market, I think you're getting pretty decent value from this graphics card. Yeah, you're not going to be getting crazily high FPS in AAA games, but when you're spending this amount of money on a graphics card, I don't think it's fair to expect that from this GPU. And thankfully, the 8GB of VRAM held up in these titles as well, which is brilliant. 1440p is, it's okay, it's not terrible. I think the saving grace here is DLSS, where you can put that onto quality and you'll get 60 FPS in most of these games. Failing that, you could do some settings tweaking, and in especially the case of like Cyberpunk and maybe Star Wars Jedi Survivor, you can get above that sweet spot of 60 frames per second there. But where settings tweaking won't really be a concern is eSports titles, because in Fortnite, when we just set it to DirectX 11 on the low preset, yeah, we are literally getting bucket loads of performance. Just shy of 500 FPS at 1080p is pretty good performance in my book. The CPU matters a lot more here. Anyways, the frame time is, well, pretty great by Fortnite standards at around 326, so that's great news right there. When we go up to 1440p, the average frame rate drops to around 330 FPS, which is still very good, and if you've got a 360Hz monitor, I suspect you're going to be having a great time here. And not only that, the 1% lows are also looking pretty good here as well. 1080p in Rainbow Six Siege X is, well, great again. We're getting just over 300 FPS on average with a very smooth frame time of 243, so you're going to be having absolutely zero issues here with like a 240Hz monitor. And when we go up to 1440p, yeah, you are dropping in average frame rate quite a bit, but to be honest, on a graphics card like this in a game which is low-key kind of hard to run in Rainbow Six Siege, yeah, you're going to be getting pretty good performance here at Quad HD. And I forgot to mention, the frame time is also looking great. Counter-Strike 2 is not really that well optimized, particularly with the 1% lows I've noticed, but the average frame rates on the 3060 Ti are looking pretty good. You're getting around 320 FPS at 1080p with a 1% low that's trailing that by, well, 200 frames per second, which is not ideal. And then at 1440p, we can tell we were CPU bound because the average frame rate barely budges, and in fact the 1% lows go up by 9 FPS. So dare I say that 1440p is probably the best way to play Counter-Strike because it's that heavy on your processor. So as long as you've got a decent CPU, eSports performance with the 3060 Ti is really not going to be a problem. At 1080p, we're getting absolute bucket loads of performance, and much to the point where I'd say if you were to invest in like a 360Hz monitor, I suspect you'll be having a pretty decent time on this graphics card, especially in something like Fortnite, for instance. But when we up the resolution to 1440p, yeah, we'll start to lose some performance, but even if you had a 144Hz, they're getting pretty affordable now, I would say that's a pretty decent sweet spot, especially for competitive gaming. And as 8GB graphics cards are becoming less desirable in 2025, you could probably start to get some pretty decent deals on one of these GPUs. Because after all, video memory really doesn't matter for esports and competitive games, as they're highly optimized, and let's be honest, the texture work in these games isn't exactly next generation. But where VRAM will matter is with ray tracing, and Indiana Jones is a prime example of where 8GB graphics cards are like kind of the bare minimum now. Because on the medium preset with DLSS upscaling, we are getting quite a lot of performance at 1080p, in fact to the point where you probably don't even need upscaling because you're getting just south of 120 FPS, which is brilliant. The 1% lows are also looking great as well, so there's zero issues there. Going up to 1440p, we see the average frame rate drop quite significantly down to 68, and the 1% low is around 53, so the frame time is still looking pretty decent here. And dare I say, this is a very playable experience in a game that still looks pretty decent on the medium preset. Cyberpunk on RT Medium is not the most transformative ray tracing experience ever, but it still looks pretty decent, I'd like to say, and performance at 1080p is still quite good. We're getting around 73 FPS on average, which is, well, yeah, not bad by any means, and the 1% lows are still holding up there. But when we go up to 1440p, we do see that average frame rate drop quite significantly, so I'll just disable ray tracing entirely because of this. And towards the end of our benchmarking run, we were running into some stutters, which tells me that 8GB of VRAM wasn't really holding up here. So yeah, I don't recommend ray tracing on a 3060 Ti if you can avoid it. So ray tracing is technically doable on the 3060 Ti, especially at 1080p with upscaling. Admittedly, this isn't the most optimum way of playing a game, but in some games you can't disable ray tracing altogether, like Indiana Jones. So it's a good job that the 3060 Ti handles these games, or that game, pretty decently. I admit that the sample size here was quite small. To be honest, that's because I don't really recommend ray tracing on this, and I think the two games that we tested paints a pretty clear picture of what ray tracing is going to be like. In games where it's an option, just disable it. It's really not worth it, but it can still play games where it's mandated, where it's a must, but you have to enable it, if you catch my drift. So I think it's fair to say that the 3060 Ti is a solid 1080p card. In all of the games we tested today, it got on pretty decently at full HD, even when we had to enable upscaling with ray tracing results, which is not something I necessarily recommend, but it's still doable, if that makes sense. But where you'll want to go is with rasterization, if you can help it, because here the 3060 Ti gets on perfectly fine. Even in unoptimized Unreal Engine 5 games like Stalker 2, you're still getting at least 60 FPS, albeit on the medium preset with high textures, but we didn't run into any VRAM problems, which is a big bonus, I'd like to say. Where VRAM might come into the equation ever so slightly is 1440p. In our testing suite today, we didn't notice any VRAM related problems, but this doesn't mean that this is going to be the case in every single title out there, especially some of the newer Unreal Engine games. But to truly get the most out of this graphics card, I'd recommend enabling DLSS and putting that onto quality. It works absolutely fine at 1440p. I've done it a lot in the past, especially with like the RTX 3080, and I even do it with the 5070 Ti in some games, and I think it gets on absolutely brilliantly. And I think most gamers won't even tell if DLSS is on or not if they look at the image quality, but if they look at the frame rate, yeah, they might be able to tell. And especially this will help us out with VRAM as well, as we're rendering at a lower resolution. But for less than 200 quid, the 3060 Ti is really not that bad of a card, but there's one problem with this, and that's the 3070. It goes for like an extra like £20 here on eBay in the UK, which is kind of wild because I'll just go with the 3070. Yes, it's still got 8GB of VRAM, but to be honest, it's got a much more powerful core, and that is probably the card I'd go with. And then of course you've got models like the RX 6700 XT, which have 12GB of VRAM, which won't be giving you any problems, at least in all of the games that are made today at 1440p, because you're not going to be path tracing on a graphics card like that. So that's another consideration that you could put in. I've also got one, so if you want to see benchmarks, they're somewhere on the channel. But for the Team Red card, the upscaling implementation isn't particularly the best. It's still on the older FSR 3.1 model, which is nowhere near as close to DLSS, especially at lower resolutions. But this competitive price point does have a lot of graphics cards from you to choose from, and I think you can't go wrong with most of them, especially something like the RTX 3070 and even the 3060 Ti if you can find it for the right price, which I personally wouldn't pay anything over sort of £180 for this graphics card, in my opinion. Anyways, if you want a budget graphics card which has got more VRAM than this, you can watch in a video up here. I think you'll like that one. Anyways, I'll catch you in the next one.